You should know some things about the assassin before you end up facing off against it. For example, the assassin has a variety of attacks, and like any animal, it is more dangerous when backed into a corner. The assassin can rear up and stab you with a spear-like bone. This will not only hurt like hell, but if you don't tend the wound immediately, it will leave you bleeding out. No, Hunter. But don't think you're safe just because you took your distance. If too far away, the assassin will send a bone spear hurtling towards you. So goddamn hard that even if it misses you by an inch or two, the shotgun impact of the spear's landing point will deal damage in a small area. And yes, somehow even that will leave you bleeding. Do you remember the aforementioned manifestations of itself? Well, the assassin creates these two clones that approach you while the original hides. If by any chance you manage to get too close to one of these clones, they will explode, dealing a little bit of damage, yeah, but filling your vision with bugs. After a few moments, if the clones cannot find something to hinder, they will just disappear. Speaking of bugs, those bugs blinding you, yeah, you can remove them if you're fast enough. It's really difficult, but I've seen it being done before. Now, if you've managed to strike it quite a few times, don't get too cocky. If heavily wounded, it will go into a frenzy. And while in this frenzy, the assassin will spawn two more clones that will cloud your vision. If a clone manages to successfully hinder someone's view, the assassin will use his bone spears to cut him down. Oh no, but that's not it. If you manage to kill the clones, the assassin will simply spawn new ones. This will go on and on and on until you manage to kill it for good. So, how do you hurt it, you ask? Well, like any other bug, poison it. Poison is extremely effective dealing with this shit. If that doesn't work, melee attacks will serve you well. But if you're feeling particularly bold, it will die to one well-thrown big-ass dynamite bundle.
Shortly after, I was fired from the paper. My editor, John C. Wycliffe, took objection to my portrayal of the events of the lynching. I later on found out that he was prominently involved, but by that time I was in the employ of another, Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana, Hiram Arlott himself. My work was clerical and tiresome. I drank often and in quantity. My evenings spent in a stupor. It was during this time I met a dear friend of mine, Vincent Orsica, a friendship of chance. We always seemed to meet at night, in one saloon or another. Some years my senior, he gave me valuable advice over countless whiskeys and cigarettes. Over a year or so, as my trust in him grew, I shared all manner of secrets. I was close with Mr. Lott, and we frequently argued. The accounts of such disagreements seemed to interest Vincent greatly, and I shared them willingly, secretly delighted to have a rapt attention of one I respected so greatly. Eventually, he took pity on my health and began taking me for long walks in the woods and practicing a bit of sport shooting. The first time I saw him sober, I still remember being surprised, to say the least, at how tall he was. These walks developed into hikes and hunts and had a tremendous impact on my health. and would prove invaluable practice. The last time I saw Vincent, we drank until morning. I'd been recounting a particularly funny disagreement over a continued obsession of Mr. Lott's. He was a great believer in an Atlantic-Pacific canal through Nicaragua. I was a stern critic. There were issues closer to home for him to worry about, and the Air Force in Panama was an unmitigated failure. Nevertheless, and against my advice, Mr. Lott had sailed to Nicaragua that afternoon, and I was once again out of work. We left the saloon at dawn. I think it was the drink, but as Vincent walked away, he seemed to split and multiply, eventually vanishing down a dozen alleys. Hiram R. Lott died out in Nicaragua, and another man was sworn in his position of lieutenant governor. Wandering the docks, thoroughly inebriated, I eventually found work with a man by the name of Samson. Thus was my introduction to this bloody and violent work. It was a far cry from writing, though I hoped I could serialize my adventures at some point in the future. It was through Samson that I met a young group of other hunters, and together we one day found ourselves in the upper gantries of the new prison, out in the Lawson Way. The first of my friends was blinded by a thrown clump of insects that crawled over his face, some even disappearing down his throat. Screaming, he was hardly aware of the shadow rising behind him. We watched, mouth agape, as it grew and grew to its full stature. Then suddenly, drove a blade clean through the belly and let him drop. To my knowledge, that was the assassin's first kill. We immediately started firing. The assassin seemed to split into 3 other creatures and rushed the next of us. One flew straight at me, and I hit it with a single shot. But it burst, and before I knew it, my mouth was full of legs, thoraxes, and mandibles, bills crawling across my face and my airways. By the time I cleared them, I saw another of my friends get jabbed in the stomach by the assassin, darting to avoid a final swing of his axe, then slashing his throat, and blood bubbling out of the clean gash. I saw then into the void of the monster's face, and the most remarkable feeling struck me. The feeling of recognition. I vowed on my father's words to prevent that from happening again. The massacre of my comrades would be the last. I would, from now on, arm the hunters, not with weapons, but with the knowledge they need to survive out here. It was that moment of recognition that led me here to where I am today. For in that void, all I saw was Vincent. I went through everything I read in the last few years. I turned out my humble quarters for every scrap of paper I've jotted on, every memory I've crystallized into writing. I visited psychologists, chemists, and mystics, anyone who could do anything to help me remember. I needed to recall everything I could about Vincent. A crumbled note and incessant questioning of strangers of the street took me to his quarters, a dilapidated garret overlooking the prison where the lynching took place. Again, a sense of recognition struck me. As I walked the streets outside, I realized I'd been there before. The alley the man had disappeared down. I put everything relevant into paper. Another line of inquiry took me closer. Apparently, another hunter had seen the assassin, someone by the name of Lantern. I found him out in the bayou, deep in the hunting grounds, inhabiting an abandoned church. He was dressed in black and had strong bones from his clothes, yet his face was youthful and plain. The assassin had come to him one night, and they had fought until the morning. The fight was only over when he'd planted a blast from his Romero straight in his chest, which had caused it to recoil and flee. I asked him where this had taken place. He laughed and gestured to the church, for he was waiting for it to come back. Disturbed, I returned to the city. Bringing everything together, I had a picture of the assassin. I presented this information to other hunters, and not before long, I was ready to track it down and kill it. Only I didn't. My men stopped me. They promised me a share of the bounty, but the information I assembled was too valuable. They couldn't risk losing me. At the end, they asked him to study the monsters, to illuminate them about the creatures of the bayou. He's ashamed to say he assented, but I'm glad he did, and thus Harold's Black Journal was born. It found its way to me, and finally, it found its way to you, Hunter. Now, the only thing to do is light the shadow that has so dogged our steps on the brightest days.